Theatre. My name's Rob Drummer, I'm the Associate Dramaturg here at the Bush, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you and our panel to the BushGreen Live Debate for the Invisible by Rebecca Lenkovich. We host these events for each of the plays we produce. It's an opportunity to open up some of the ideas, the themes. We won't be giving away the play to those of you who are watching it afterwards, but it is an opportunity just to kind of welcome in the panel here to talk about some of the ideas, the questions that the play will raise when you see it later. I'm going to introduce, sort of from my far right here, Richard Miller, qualified as a solicitor in 1992, is currently head of legal aid at the Law Society, where since 2010 he has led the work against legal aid cuts. Over the past year he has specifically headed up the Society's Access to Justice campaign. We've also got next to him Karina Kaur, who manages the advocacy team for South All Black Sisters, a not-for-profit organisation set up in 1979 to meet the needs of Black, Asian and African Caribbean and minority ethnic women. Next to Karina is Cris McCurley, who is head of international family law and a partner of Ben Hall Bell LLP. Cris was awarded the National Law Society Lawyer of the Year Award in 2014 and Inspirational Women of Law 2015. To my left, Sue James, who is a social justice campaigner and is currently the supervising solicitor at Hammersmith and Fulham Law Centre. Sue was shortlisted for Legal Aid Lawyer of the Year in 2013. And then on my far left, we have Fiona Bawdon, who is a journalist, campaigner and researcher, focusing mainly on civil and criminal justice, particularly youth justice. She's editor of Legal Action magazine and is the founder and coordinator of the Legal Aid Lawyer of the Year Awards. Thank you very much for joining us. So this evening, we're going to be sort of asking broadly the question, in an age of austerity, why defend legal aid? I think it might be helpful to sort of start us off, Richard, and if you wouldn't mind, just giving us a potted history, perhaps a definition of legal aid, if I could start with you.
Indeed. Legal aid was set up in 1949, and if ever there was a time of austerity, that was it. It was set up in recognition of the injustices that were seen to arise without it, when people were unable to enforce or defend their rights. The purpose of legal aid was that nobody should be unable to enforce or defend their rights for want of the money to afford the advice and representation that they needed. And it is an unfortunate fact that professionals cost money. If any of you have ever paid a vet's bill and stopped to work out what that would work out on an hourly rate, it is a very high sum. Private dentist's fees, similarly. And if you ever break down on a motorway and have to call out a breakdown service, even skilled trades, as well as professionals, are very expensive. And it was recognised that most ordinary families would not be able to afford to pay for legal fees if they ran into difficulties. Unlike vet's appointments and dental treatment, legal matters can run on for weeks, months, sometimes even years, requiring many, many hours and days of professional input. And that is why they are largely beyond the reach of ordinary working people. So legal aid was set up to ensure that people were effectively able to enforce and defend their rights so that the rule of law was respected in this country. If you are someone very rich and very powerful and you know that people can't enforce their rights against you, you have no incentive to respect their rights. Everyone benefits when people are able to enforce their rights against the rich and powerful. So legal aid was set up in the aftermath of the Second World War as part of the welfare state alongside education and the NHS. And for the first 30 years it grew very successfully. It covered family law, it covered criminal law, and in the 1970s we had a generation of radical campaigning lawyers who set up law centres and legal aid firms to bring legal solutions to the issue of the unscrupulous landlords that we'd seen in the 1960s, to incompetent local authorities failing to process people's benefits claims properly and failing to deliver the services that they were entitled to. And in 1980, something like 80% of households qualified for some help through the legal aid system, and it covered pretty much any sort of legal problem that most people would ever face. Since 1990, however, the direction has been very much in the opposite direction, with the system chiselled away year after year. The rates paid to legal aid lawyers were, up until that time, a small amount below what they would charge private clients. The rates set in the early 1990s have not been increased in cash terms since then. The rates are now about a quarter of what lawyers would charge private clients. Legal aid lawyers today probably earn around about £25,000 to £35,000 per year, less than teachers, nurses and other valuable public servants. The scope of the legal aid system has been cut year on year, and obviously since 2010 that position has become much worse. The legal aid budget is often said by the government to be out of control, but let's put that in perspective. In 2004, the legal aid budget was £2 billion per year. During the Blair years, the annual increase in the NHS budget was £6 billion a year. So the annual spend on ensuring that ordinary people can enforce and defend their rights was 1/3 of the annual increase in the NHS budget. It is margin of error stuff in public spending terms, but so important in what it does for society and for ordinary people. That 2004 budget of £2 billion was unchanged by 2010. It was still at £2 billion. But at that stage, we faced the coalition government, a new age of austerity, and the determination to bring in the further cuts, which have seen the decimation of the system over the past 5 years.
Thank you, Richard. Sue, can I come to you next and just hear a little bit, I suppose, about the impact over the last 5 years, I suppose, in particular in your work and what's changed and how's that sort of translated into your kind of daily experience?
Okay. I think the overwhelming issue has been the severe reduction of scope of legal aid. And so that happened in 2013. Prior to that, we'd seen a reduction in the spend so that cases were not being paid at the value that they were, that costed. Fixed fees were introduced, and now a housing case is paid at £157, regardless of how much time pretty much you do on that. So we were seeing reductions in services, but it wasn't until 2013 that the scope of legal aid changed. And so what we saw was that benefits were taken out of scope: employment, immigration, a large amount of housing. The only thing that remains in for housing and debt is defending possession and some serious disrepair and homelessness. So it means that what we can do for clients is severely reduced, and the access to justice is just not there. And you know, in answer to your question, why defend legal aid provision in an age of austerity? We have to think about, you know, austerity for who? Austerity for our clients only, for the poor, you know, for the vulnerable, the disabled. And I don't think we can have austerity justice. I think the answer has to be a big fat no.
Thank you. Access to justice is definitely one of the themes in the play, actually, and something that Rebecca, from the very beginning of this commission, was sort of chasing after as a major idea at the heart of the play. Karina, I suppose, an organisation that has been sort of going now for a number of decades, I can't imagine you're seeing less people coming to you asking for help. What's the impact been for you since 2010?
The impact is really that the service that we provide to people is increasing, the demand is increasing. However, the cuts mean that we can't give them that service. So, for example, we work with black and minority women, and their needs are very complex, and legal aid is an access to not only justice but to protection. So, for example, you can get civil remedies for problems. For example, you can get civil remedies from your partners who may be abusive. You can have protective orders, and in more complex cases that we work with forced marriage victims, we work with women that may have suffered or may undergo FGM. And there are civil remedies for that. These women are unlikely, or young children, are unlikely to come out to the police and disclose these forms of abuse. So the court system works much better. However, if these services are taken away and solicitors can't cope with the demand because the money they receive is so little for the work that they do, these women are left with no protection, and they become often litigants in persons. They will go to court hearings, they will go to court alone without legal aid, legal representation, and that's very difficult, especially if they've come out of a very vulnerable situation and legal jargon is very hard to understand. So, yes, I defend legal aid.
Thank you very much. We've been sort of struck here at the Bush over the course of the last year and a half by, several headlines, images of barristers on strike and courts closing, and this has been a narrative that's been kind of running alongside the development of the play. What's also been really interesting for us as a theatre that sort of, is producing this play is how you try and humanise the narrative. And Cris, I wonder, that image of sort of the fat cat lawyer, which comes up as an idea in the play, are we kind of anywhere close getting the public behind the impact of these cuts?
I think not. I mean, I've spent the last 5 years talking to audiences like this one about the impact of the cuts to legal aid. And I don't know how many practitioners there are in the audience tonight, perhaps because it's a debate, there might be more than there would normally be. Members of the public do not know what is happening with legal aid, and the government has very, very carefully spun it in the press as being about, the legal aid cuts are solely about fat cat lawyers crying about their wages, basically. You never ever hear anyone talking about fat cat nurses. And yet the starting salary for a newly qualified legal aid lawyer, certainly in the northeast of England, is exactly the same as the starting salary for a newly qualified nurse. I think most people can imagine needing the health service at some point in their lives, so I think it's a much easier sell for a government who's wanting to cut their budget, particularly when we're told repeatedly that these are times of austerity. But the reality is that this is ideological. This is nothing to do with saving money, because we've now had 3 cross-party government inquiries about the impact of the cuts to legal aid, all of which have come out and said that the bottom line for the Ministry of Justice is that they can say that they're saving money. The bottom line for the system as a whole is that unexpected or possibly anticipated additional expenses springing up here, there and everywhere. So, for example, doctors are now spending a huge amount of time dealing with issues of social justice rather than dealing with medical issues as they become medical issues, because people are so stressed and distressed that they can't get their rights met. There's a really, really simple equation. Richard talked about the human rights and why we have human rights. That human rights plus access to justice equals equality. And no government can ever say, particularly not a signatory to the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, can ever say we cannot afford justice. That is just unacceptable in today's society. And what is happening is that we are seeing women who are genuine victims of domestic abuse, genuine victims, long-term victims of abuse, who cannot access the legal aid system because they cannot get one of the very narrowly defined, very high hurdle level of proof that they have in order to prove to the legal aid authority that they are genuine victims of violence. And that bar has been set deliberately high. The latest research from Rights of Women stated that 38% of genuine victims of abuse cannot get access to legal aid, and yet the government has promised us that all victims of domestic violence will get legal aid. That is a promise they've made, and that's been all over the press, all over the media. A further 23% could get one of the types of proofs, but they're more than 24 months old. Now, the government knows from their own research that the impact of severe, chronic, long-term domestic abuse does not dissipate when 24 months roll around. In fact, they can last a lifetime. And we're seeing women with post-traumatic stress disorder, that violence that goes back years, that we're having to turn away and say, I'm sorry, we can't help you, because you can't get this ridiculous high proof requirement in order to entitle us to then take your case forward. And I could talk all night, but I'll probably shut up there. And you can come back to me if there's any of those other points you want me to enlarge on.
Absolutely. Only yesterday, sort of the art sector were put on sort of alert for between 25 and 40% cuts to the budget, the DCMS budget. We are so-called living through this age of austerity. And Fiona, I wonder, should we defend legal aid, and why should we if every government department that isn't sort of ring-fenced is facing the same problem?
We should defend legal aid for all kinds of reasons, not least for some of the reasons that Cris talked about. Every pound spent on legal aid you get your money back and more further down the track. If you spend £1 on legal aid keeping somebody in their home, you save all that money on homelessness. But the question is how you do that, how you defend legal aid. And again, Cris touched on some of the story that the government tells about legal aid and the press tells about legal aid, which is that there's too much of it, the wrong people are getting it, lawyers are doing too well out of it, and anyway we can't afford it because of all this austerity. And it's a very lawyer response to try and fight that with statistics, but you don't counter a story with facts, sadly. You counter a story with another story. And I think that's what we are still kind of wrestling with, is that we need a better story. We need to tell a better story about legal aid. And talking about lawyers' salaries and scope and things, people don't understand what you mean by that. I don't know what that other story is. That's a really complicated issue. But there is evidence from the States. There's an organisation that I don't know well that called America's Voice, which sort of came out of the migrants' rights movement, because they say in terms they were just basically getting their asses kicked. They were losing the debate. They were coming up with statistics and they were losing the debate. They were losing the narrative. And so they have come up with a whole kind of story around immigrants, which kind of ties in with the American dream and why it's all part of the culture. And I think, we need to do an equivalent thing here. And there is a massive evidence, again, as Cris touched on, about the impact on people's health. If you don't get access to social welfare advice, it makes people ill. They are going to their GPs in greater numbers because it's having terrible impact on them physically and mentally, particularly on young people. The statistics around young, vulnerable people who've got problems with housing or their benefits, suffering from mental health problems as a result of that. Just a frightening, 50% of vulnerable young people who've got social welfare problems suffer from sort of things like anxiety and depression. And there may be, there's a whole story to be told around that, and that's one reason why this play, this initiative, and what Rebecca has done and what Bush is doing is brilliant, because that's another way of getting those messages.
Well, that idea of telling the story, Sue and your colleagues at Hammersmith and Fulham Law Centre were incredibly helpful and allowed us in the second week of rehearsals to sort of go down and spend time with you over an afternoon. So the cast and Rebecca, the director, Michael, and I sort of came and spent probably too long kind of taking out of your day. But it was, I think, quite important, both for the development of the script and for the company, to sort of hear some of those very human stories. I don't know if you want to kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, in essence, that the clients that I represent don't have a voice. And I see it as my job to give them a voice, to uncover the story behind the problem, and make them real, because I think they're not seen as real people and they have real issues. And I think, what's great is that one of the stories, I won't give it away, but ends up in the play, and that was a real client of mine who was facing eviction. And that's what we see day in, day out. And I think that until we start to get that message across, and the play actually made me think about Dickens and about the messages and stories, and that whole thing about stories, that if he just wrote about facts and figures, we wouldn't be thinking about poverty and deprivation in the way that we did. And I think his message is still really relevant today, and it's like 200 years old. So I think we do have to think about how we portray, and I think the play is a great starting point. And what I loved about Rebecca's writing is that she got that message about a voice and bringing that voice out, and that our clients are invisible, and the press treats them really badly. So I think it's a great starting point, but we need to work from that. Yeah, I wonder, Richard, as well, you've been sort of running this campaign over the past year, and and that work continues, it doesn't stop, but what are the stories that we aren't hearing, I suppose, or what are the stories that aren't connecting with people?
Well, for one example, I was talking to some practitioners in Wales a few weeks back, and I was asking them what is happening to the clients who would previously have qualified for legal aid. And one of them told me about a client that they'd had in a housing matter, and it was one of those where there was some serious disrepair and there were other issues around the matter that had to be resolved. Once the court granted an order ordering the landlord to do the repairs, the legal aid agency said, OK, the legal aid bit's completed, we're pulling the plug. And that left the client completely stranded in trying to resolve the other issues. And that client committed suicide. And I was told by one of the other practitioners there that they'd had a client who had attempted suicide but fortunately not succeeded when left in a similar situation. That is the impact that these cuts have on ordinary people facing these desperate situations.
I wonder, Cris, as well, if you could sort of open the idea of kind of how the law is not a fixed entity at all. It's changing, it's evolving, it's morphing, and the sorts of impact, I suppose, on our laws that sort of cases sort of funded through legal aid have, which has been something I think for the company here working on the play that's been particularly interesting. That, you know, I think Sue, you offered up an example about the use of DNA in a certain case, and we were really struck actually that these cases do have an impact that reaches far beyond that one case.
Well, for example, we've just had, as of last Friday, a law change that introduces protection from female genital mutilation. And now there is a criminal law, but there's also a civil form of protection for FGM. And but following very much along the lines of forced marriage protection orders. And that has been an incredible, the ripple effect from the Forced Marriage Protection Act has had an incredible impact on raising awareness around forced marriage within the entirety of society in the UK, in a way that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise, and has led young women to coming, and a lot of young men as well actually, to coming forward and seeking help and getting help. I think it's, particularly when it's human rights led, as these types of legislation are, then it has a huge impact. And yeah, I mean, I think one of the real dangers of taking away legal aid, and I know that the government has said that they will always give legal aid for victims of forced marriage, and presumably the same will follow for FGM. But one of the things that's happened behind the scenes is that they've made it so difficult to actually access that. So, for example, some of the types of proof that we have to provide, victims have to pay for. And if a young woman that I'm seeing, for example, has no recourse to public funds because she doesn't have an immigration status in the UK, then how is she going to pay for proof that she is a victim of abuse? In a particular case of forced marriage, and this is something that we've been campaigning against for the last 5 years, where a young woman had accessed her protection using the FM Protection Act. She was asked when she got her legal aid, she has no recourse to public funds, she'd been in the UK for 3 months only, she'd been living with her in-laws and her husband, and I delegated functions. That's a technical way of saying I gave myself legal aid because that's something we can do in emergencies. On the basis that she had no bank account, no income, and therefore she would satisfy the means criteria. I was then asked by the Legal Aid Authority to get her to provide 12 months' worth of statements from anybody who had ever given her a hot meal, a bed for the night. It had to be an original signed statement. It had to be one that gave a monetary value of the benefit that was given to her as a result of that hot meal, cup of tea or whatever it was. And, you know, bearing in mind she's been in the UK for 3 months living with the perpetrators of the abuse she's experiencing, I don't think I would have found it very easy to obtain any kind of financial evidence from them. And then we look back further than that, and that's her family in Azad Kashmir, who live in a tiny village and don't speak any English and in fact are not literate. So the hurdles that are being put in the way, even though the legislation is there, the hurdles that are being put in the way of people on an everyday basis make it almost impossible, if not impossible. And in fact, many people just give up and stay in abusive situations.
Fiona, one of, and I might credit this with Richard, but forgive me if this is not you who said this, but I think in the first week of rehearsals we heard this idea that our government don't understand that poor people aren't just rich people with no money. You know, there is, which is something that kind of went up on the wall, I think, in the rehearsal room and sort of stuck with us. And I suppose I'm sort of what's really going on here. It's not just sort of the cut to a legal aid budget. It's, you know, it's small fry. There's, to give away one line, you know, the HS2 budget is 52 billion, and the legal aid budget is 2 billion. You know, there are other priorities, financial priorities for government. You know, what do we need to do? What do we need to connect this to? You know, we've just seen a budget that kind of is hacking back welfare, you know, benefits more broadly. What is that campaign? What does it look like? You know, how do we tell the story of legal aid in the broader context, I suppose?
I mean, that's a really, really complex question, and what would be great would be to get different campaigning organisations together to really kind of research what resonates with the public, how you do tell that story. That's quite a big question, but which somebody should do. Certainly. There are, I mean, sort of to answer it in a smaller, more immediate way, there is some interesting work being done. So my colleague here from the Low Commission with putting advice into GP surgeries to give people better access to it. And it may just simply be by linking it more to health and GPs, you immediately give it a more acceptable kind of profile. It's seen as less sort of unnecessary, you know, it's understood in that kind of context. And there are also things I think, and it may not make me very popular with the lawyers in this audience, that the profession can do. The profession could do more, I mean, with what resources, who knows, but to be more innovative in terms of using technology to reach people. And again, there's a line, I think, in the Low Commission report, which is a report into social welfare law, that just because sort of IT doesn't work for everybody, it doesn't mean it doesn't work for anybody. And I think the profession's starting point is slightly that the system we had before was the best system. This is the great system, the model where people turn up and, you know, bring all their stuff with them, and you have face-to-face meetings with people. And for some people that may be, you know, by far the best way of doing it, but for others it isn't. And law centres have traditionally, some of them have been quite bad, you know, just letting people queue and having notices on the website saying we don't open the doors before this time, you know, you will have to wait outside, which is warning you, you know, if you only the first number of people may be seen. And if somebody, you know, who may be a victim of domestic violence has schlepped up there with their kids, you know, they've got no money, they've managed to get themselves there, and then to not be seen because they weren't one of the first 6 people. I mean, that can't be acceptable either. So I think the narrative that the previous system was as good as it could have been and really suited clients, I'm not sure is correct either. It may have suited lawyers, and it may have been quite a traditional way for lawyers to work. But I think, you know, there are some aspects of that need looking at as well.
Is there that space for innovation? Is there the time for that innovation? I mean...
Well, I think the key problem is that the government approached this from the point of view of, if we axe legal aid, these other solutions will magically appear from nowhere. What they didn't do was develop these other solutions and then say, OK, now these solutions are here, now we can reduce the expenditure of legal aid. There may well be things that can be done with technology. I agree with Fiona. I think the profession does take an unduly conservative approach to these things, and technology probably can play a larger role than some lawyers would accept.
But it is really hard for people to innovate when they're cut to the bone. I mean, that's the problem. It will need a massive amount of investment. It's got to come from somewhere.
That's the reality.
I agree.
Yeah. But the flip side is the government is too quick to say the technology is the solution to everything. And this really comes back to my comment about poor people are not just rich people without money. The average MP probably could go online and find a solution and be quite happy with it. The average person without that level of education and without that level of resource and support networks around them may well not be able to do so. So it's not as easy as the government makes out. But I think there are things that the profession should be looking at. Technology is moving on so fast, year by year at the moment. There are things you can do this year that would have been science fiction only 5 years ago. So we do have to keep looking at this and keep seeing what ways can we adapt technology to deliver services in different ways and to deliver different services. A good example is there is an app that's been created for road accidents. So you have this on your phone. If you have an accident, you go into the app, you take photos of the accident, you record the details of the other driver, you hit send, and it goes straight off to the solicitor to start processing your claim. A brilliant way of using technology there. A brilliant bit of marketing by the firm concerned. So there are things that can be done, and there are things that actually make business sense for the solicitors as well. This is what's so tragic. We've got to the stage where delivering social welfare services is not commercially possible. And that's even with innovation at this stage. Innovation is too expensive, it's too risky for businesses to be able to do that at the moment. And if the government supported innovation and continued to fund the services that people need until that innovation is effective in delivering what's required, we might be in a less toxic position than we are at the moment.
But I think one of the main issues for me is that my clients who are almost inevitably women who have experienced some form of abuse or their children have, they're the ones who are having to innovate. And I've had clients who have had to take out payday loans in order to protect their children. I've had clients who have actually turned tricks, become prostitutes temporarily to get the money together to fight their case. And one of the things that we used to do as a practice, and I'm sure most other practices did as well, was we used to do a huge amount of pro bono work, because we could manage to do that within, within our budgets. Now that the budgets have been slashed to the bone, as Fiona says, we can no longer do that pro bono work. So even when somebody comes to us and they say that they've got a child who was born a victim of a rape, and the father who has raped the mother and produced the child is fighting for either residence or contact of that child, we're having to turn that person away and say, I'm sorry, you don't have proof of domestic violence evidence. I can't do anything to help you. And that's entirely wrong. And that cannot be acceptable in society. It just can't.
But also, I think we have to remember our client groups. And I think, as a housing lawyer, most of my clients suffer with some kind of disability or mental illness, and their lives aren't the same as you and I. They don't have the equipment to be able to do that. And I think that, we just have to remember that. And, a lot of my clients don't even open letters, let alone they live these chaotic lives that you need to be able to piece back together for them to then move on. And I think those are the complicated things. And I think, in most of my cases, there are those illness and other issues there.
So I think things like this play and also the Justice Alliance film that probably a lot of people will have seen. If you haven't seen it, please go to the website and look at it. Really explains the human side, the human cost of taking away legal aid from people. And the quote about people without money just being the same as rich people, they just haven't got money, and it is entirely misdirecting the public's attention, I think, because as you said, a lot of our clients are chaotic, a lot of them are extremely vulnerable. Telling their human story, as I do when I'm talking to people about legal aid cuts, is probably the most impactful way of getting the message across. It's been very, very difficult to get into the press because the press like stories about fat cat lawyers. They don't like stories about people who really need help and can't get it. But things like this, and also what we've been doing is we've been keeping a record of all the people that we've had to turn away. And that's going to eventually become part of a report that's going to the UN. Because we've told the government we're having to turn people away, and we've told them under what circumstances and how unjust it is. And the government isn't listening. They really are not listening, and in fact they don't care, because it is ideological. And they've created this myth of the undeserving underclass. And that's what we're battling as much as the cuts to legal aid, I think.
Thank you. I might just sort of open up to sort of questions, sort of particularly, maybe rather than comments first, but if there are any questions, I'll sort of jump around and take a couple of them. So let's go to the man here in the red top first.
I'm Klaus Buchholz from Hamburg, Germany. I have a question. I wonder how your government gets away with this kind of legislation, because in our country there would be a check, and the check is the Constitutional Court. And I think everything you tell us here affects the constitutional rights of citizens. And so I think in my country I can very well imagine that the Constitutional Court would just void any legislation of this kind.
So the question there is how do the government get away with these cuts?
Only for a constitutional court like that. Yes. The answer is because
you have Magna Carta, you know.
Yes, the government's very fond of celebrating it. So
A great expense.
Yes.
I think what's important is that there's two dialogues going on, and the government say that they want to protect people, that suffer in domestic violence, and then the other dialogue is, for example, we help a lot of women that have immigration issues, and there is a recognition that women will stay in abusive situations for longer if they are bound by this immigration issue. They will be. It's a bargaining tool for perpetrators. However, these immigrants are, you know, the evils of society according to the government. So that's how they get away with it, you know. Yeah. And the true story behind this immigrant person is, they will not get anything for legal aid in terms of securing the immigration status. There's only 2 forms of legal aid available. That's if you want to claim asylum, which is horribly difficult to do so, and if you've come on a spouse visa, which a lot of people haven't. And if you even do make the checks for the legal aid, as you were saying, you may be living with other migrant people and they're unwilling to write these letters of support to say, we've supported you. So these women just become more underground and their needs are not addressed, they're not met, and that's how the government get away with it.
When the Act was going through Parliament, it was very noticeable that in the House of Lords, where there were a lot of lawyers, a lot of judges, and a lot of just people with world experience who were not bound by party political allegiance, we won almost all the arguments and a large number of the votes. In the House of Commons, where everything is just put through on the party whip, the votes all just went through on the nod, and most of the changes that we got in the House of Lords were overturned. It's one of the ironies of this country that the House of Lords is the most indefensible part of our constitution, and yet it's the one that does give us the greatest protection. But what has happened? Well, one of the big issues is there is a provision in this Act called the exceptional funding provision, which the government said, if the person's human rights would be breached if they don't get legal aid, we will give them legal aid. They expected to give something like 6,000 people a year legal aid under this provision. In the first year, 16 people got it. The High Court last week ruled that the processes the government has set up here are unlawful because they do not deliver what Parliament demanded. And so we're still waiting to see. The government's appealing against the decision, of course. But the courts are looking at this and saying, actually, no, you know, Parliament was able to do pretty much what it liked, so long as on paper it was within the Human Rights Act. But the courts are now starting to say, but actually, the way it's being implemented actually is far more restrictive than what Parliament wanted.
As well, I think that the exceptional case funding safety net, as the government described it, has been the answer to every question raised about what are you doing, why have you taken this away. 2 years ago, I was at the United Nations in Geneva giving evidence against the government about legal aid. And I think probably the first question that was asked of the government is, I always think Dr. Ruth Kadir, who's the lead on the UK in terms of the UN commissioners, swore. She probably didn't swear, but in my memory she said, what the hell have you done with legal aid for victims of violence? And the answer was, they'll be absolutely fine because we've got exceptional case funding, and that's the safety net, and they will be picked up. When I came back, I put in a Freedom of Information Act request to the government, how many victims of violence have you given legal aid to using exceptional funding? None. And I think it's now only about 16, and it's been going for two and a half years now.
In fact, initially the government's position was because domestic violence cases are within the scope of the Act, it doesn't fall within the exceptional funding provision at all. It can't be given. It's just bizarre. And also, we're talking about the judicial reviews. There's been lots of successful judicial reviews against the government about the cuts, and that's the means that we've been using to try and enforce our human rights. So the government's answer to that is to take away the funding for judicial review and to eventually repeal the Human Rights Act. So it's a bit like they've taken away legal aid for welfare benefits, which is some of the most complex legislation we currently have in our statute books. But hey-ho, they get rid of all welfare benefits anyway. So there'll be hardly anybody who needs to use that, you know, in times to come in any event.
But I think it's really hard to engage the public about legal aid and about advice because people don't know they need it until they need it. And I think with the NHS, people think, oh, I might be able to use that in the future. I need to go and see my doctor and stuff. And so it's just kind of gone hidden. And today I was in court and the judge asked me to stay behind and was really concerned there's going to be 61 courts that are being cut, and his court is one of them, so he was really concerned about that and access to justice. But he said the consultation and the cuts are on the basis that there's going to be improved access to justice with 61 courts being cut. So you have these decision making, and you have the press saying this is more access to justice, and people are believing that. That's the problem. So it's about your stories and the voice coming out and there being a challenge. And I think the problem is that, when we've got a leader of the opposition saying that she won't come out against the new welfare reforms because she's worried about public opinion, then you haven't got an alternative voice being out there. It's, that's what we need to happen.
Let's take the next question here.
In the context of this, I'm just a citizen, but I certainly don't believe or haven't even seen any of the fat cat stories. I think a lot of people don't read those papers with any credence whatsoever. I've certainly written to my MP, joined online things, student street in front of the High Court to stop the traffic, protested. We are engaged and we do hear you, but it feels at this point now that we've lost. But obviously we can't be in a position where we've lost. So what I'd like to ask really is what's the best way that we can help you? Because it seems kind of disparate, and I don't think the separation between the NHS and yourselves is at all helpful either in the overall story. I think there is a great understanding. I mean, you're probably not getting people coming anymore because people just think it's fucked. Everyone who's in a position of having to be like legal aid knows it's screwed already, and the NHS will be next. So people probably aren't even coming. They're not even in
but that's true. There's an underspend, isn't there? Because of that reason, yes.
And in fact, there is clear evidence from a lot of places that people think legal aid is not available, even in those areas where it is. And that's why last year we actually developed some posters and leaflets to try and promote the fact that legal aid is still available for some areas and identify what those are. But we need to do a lot more to try and promote that because it's very difficult and very complex to explain where it is still available.
I think it just would be useful to know, having tried sort of writing to MPs, obviously, standard answers, and civil disobedience, for which I would be screwed if I got arrested now as well. And what's the best, what is the most useful thing you can do? Because I think we're all with you now.
This is an issue that all of us have been grappling with for years as to how do we actually bring this all together and get the force of that campaign going. And we've none of us found the argument. I mean, we were talking to a journalist recently about what's happening with the criminal legal aid cuts, and his response was, well, get back to me when a lawyer commits suicide. That's the level of what the press need to be able to take an interest in this. And the legal journalists themselves are often very sympathetic, but they've got to convince their editors that their stories that they should be running. My own view, I think, is that we need to do a lot more at the local level, at the local press level, because the more these sort of things appear in the local press, whether it's people not able to get help, protests outside courts, anything like that, the more the national press will start to see, actually there's a story here that perhaps we ought to be pursuing. So I think if we work from the grassroots up, then that may be a way to start to get a bit more interest.
And from the other end of things, I mentioned just a few minutes ago about giving evidence at Geneva. We got a determination against the government, which is like a judgment, if you will, from the United Nations, saying that what they have done, particularly around issues for women, particularly around issues for victims of violence, and the proposals for the residence test, which is another story altogether, were unacceptable and breached international convention rights. And the government trumpets at all times nothing in the legal aid changes have breached international convention rights, and there we are, we have a determination against them. They're not interested. They've been told that they've got to make changes before the next inquiry, which is going to be in another 2 years' time, and they should have produced a report in fact this month, to say what corrective action they have taken as a result of that directive from the UN. And if I can put in a call to evidence at the moment, or a call for evidence, there are a group of us who are writing the shadow report, which is going to be the Tell It Like It Is document that will go to the United Nations. The government will have to, at some point, prepare their report to say what corrective action they've taken. The shadow report is the report that tells it like it is and actually informs the UN that they haven't actually achieved what they've been ordered by them to achieve. And what we're asking, and I'll make the claim now, I'll make the call now if people don't mind, is that anyone working with victims of violence who know of anyone who can't get legal aid because of the ridiculously high evidence bar that's set for proving you are indeed a victim of violence, then please, can you let us know? If you're someone who's in a position to be able to tell us that, then please get my card or go on Ben Horbell website, because all of the documentation and the forms that we're asking people to complete are on the website. And
So what's the website?
Ben Horbell. I'll give you a card if you can help. Great. So I think that there's lots of things we can do, and there's lots of different ways of challenging this. It'd be great if there was a joined up, a holistic approach, but I think at the moment we're all so overwhelmed. We're each taking a tiny little bit of it and trying to address that bit.
What does, maybe a version of this question in a way, like what does the next 5 years, 10 years, 25 years look like? I think one of the things for the dress rehearsal of this play, we had a mixed audience in watching, and one of the men who was talking to us afterwards, actually felt quite positive that people are going to educate themselves, and if people can't access justice through a solicitor, they will go out and they will educate themselves, and will be able to confidently stand in court. It was a view that he had, that he felt there's something positive to come, and of course that was challenged quite a lot around the table from those of us who are more cynical, perhaps. But for each of you, what does 5, 10, 25 years look like? Because it's that I think we have to try and communicate. We've seen such radical, sharp change in 5 years in relation to accessing justice. Where are we headed? What's that look like? And technological innovation aside, let's say, what does that look like?
Well, I found it very interesting that the initial comments from Michael Gove have been very much to the effect that he doesn't think legal aid should be cut any further. Now, that was before the announcement yesterday that all the unprotected departments are going to have to find 25 to 40% more cuts. So whether it will survive that, I have no idea. But it's encouraging that he does appear to think that the cuts have gone as far as they should. The other thing I feel is that previously it was often invisible what solicitors did. So, for example, in family cases, solicitors are the oil in the machinery of justice. They are the ones who explain to clients what they should be doing, who help them reach a sensible settlement, who make sure that court hearings are dealt with efficiently, with all the papers prepared, and who only make the relevant arguments and don't go through the entire history of the relationship in trying to make their point to the judge. So with lawyers involved, you get fewer hearings, you get shorter hearings, and you get fewer cases going to fully contested final hearings. That was all invisible in the past. By taking the lawyers out of the system, it is becoming visible what it was that they did and why it is a valuable and cost-effective service to the taxpayer. So I do have a degree of optimism that it's going to become more and more visible why legal aid was so important, why lawyers in the system were so important, and that the case for actually restoring some of the funding and some of the services is going to grow stronger over the coming years. So my hope is we've reached the point where the pendulum has swung as far as it can in the one direction, and it will take a while before it starts swinging back to any great extent. So I would expect it to just start nudging back over the next 5 years, and then it's up to us to make sure it continues pulling back even further in the right direction.
Fiona, same question.
This isn't my suggestion. It was a judge that said it, and I can't remember which one, so apologies to him for that. But in a justice system, you can either give people lawyers, you can turn them, ordinary people, into ersatz lawyers, or you can change the system so that ordinary people can find their way around it more. I don't think either of the first two of those things is going to happen. I think the more likely thing is that the system will have to adjust, but that will only be the bits of the system that are visible, where judges are inconvenienced by litigants in person, and cases are held up and take longer, and it's all very obvious that it's all gone a bit wrong. Then the system, the government, somebody's going to have to put money into that to simplify procedures and the law to make it more user-friendly for people. So that bit I think will happen, and there may be a role for technology in that. But it's the invisible bits. It's the people that feature in this play. That nobody will see them. They just won't get justice. There just won't be anywhere for them to go. They just will stay in abusive relationships longer. They just will be more likely to be homeless. They just will not get the benefits they're entitled to. I think that's the reality of what will happen. Yeah. There may be some sort of advice agent, almost sort of going full circle, things bubbling up from communities to serve that need, which is sort of almost where the law centres came from originally. So you may end up with a bit of that going on, but it will, it won't be a perfect solution for a lot of people.
on that note, I'm going to sort of bring that to a close. Just to let you know, this debate continues. It continues online throughout the run of the play at Bush Theatre or at BushGreen Live on Twitter with the hashtag #TheInvisible2015. Thank you so much to the panel for joining us. Thank you for coming in before the show. Please